Welcome to episode 258 of Silver Lining for Learning, a guide to AI in schools, perspectives for the perplexed. Now, we're in season 6, and we only have 2 months left in season 6, believe it or not. And I've been saving Justin Reich just for this moment in time because I know he's going to provide lots of information, lots of inside jokes, and various perspectives, critical perspectives on the use of technology in education. But he's got a new guidebook. He's going to talk to us about this new guidebook, which is the title of today's show. It's not the most creative title I've ever created, but you'll have to bear with that. But this guidebook is free to download from MIT, where he works. And he is in digital media in the Comparative Media Studies and Writing Department at MIT. He's also the director of the Teaching Systems Lab, and he's author of a couple of books: Iterate, The Secret to Innovation in Schools, and Failure to Disrupt, Why Technology Alone Can't Transform Education. You might have read many of his works. If you have and you have questions for him, I'm sure he'd be willing to respond to your emails. This is not a live broadcast. We're recording right now. We're going to also talk to Jesse Dukes, who's a veteran journalist from Chicago, now living in LA, a podcast producer, a researcher, and he's got a lot of years involved in documentary studies. The two of them have teamed up, and they're going to talk about how they've teamed up to create something, I guess, a series of podcasts about AI in schools. And they also have something called the homework machine. So, Justin, you want to fill in little edges around a little bit of that and add to it, and then we'll go to Jesse to add to it, and then I'll have some questions for you.
Great. Well, Kurt and everybody, thanks so much for having us. Congrats on sustaining this effort for so many years. It's been enormously valuable to all kinds of educators and researchers across the country. Um, yeah, right when ChatGPT arrived, Jesse and I did some work with some colleagues at MIT to offer some early perspectives from some MIT faculty member on the future of generative AI and education. And one of the things that I and my co-authors felt really strongly was that it was just really important to include perspectives from teachers and students. Um, I believe that so strongly because in moments of technological change, sort of elites often have the opportunity to dominate policy conversations, future thinking conversations, but they're often really quite removed from what's actually happening and what things look like. Um, so I think talking to teachers and students in moments of change is really crucial. Jesse, who's a longtime friend of mine, came in to help us do that. And then we were just so fascinated with what we were hearing from folks. We decided to expand that effort over a couple of years. Starting last late summer, fall, we released a 7 episode limited series podcast called The Homework Machine, trying to describe the experience of the arrival of generative AI for teachers and students in schools. And along the way, a number of the teachers and school leaders we were working with said, it would be really helpful would be to have a guide that we could publish to schools to get some of these ideas out there. Following their lead, we produced one. And we can tell you more backstory about how that happened and what some of our guidelines and perspectives were for building that. But maybe Jesse can talk a little bit about who we talked to and how we found people and how we managed to talk to 120 or so teachers and students all across the country.
Yeah. I can remember, in that moment where I first had a glimmer, oh, we should talk to more people. It was a teacher named Devin O'Neill who had been on break, had taken 2 years off. And basically those 2 years were, I think, the year right after the pandemic. So roughly 21, 22, and 22, 23, and then started teaching again in the fall of 2023. And she had noticed that all of her teachers were using Bing. All of her students were using Bing. She's a social studies teacher. And she was wondering, why are they using Bing? And after a few weeks of this, she figured out that they were kind of taking questions she was asking in class and feeding them into Bing's Copilot, which was a free way to use ChatGPT. And in sort of 2 years, she dipped out of education, and in 2 years there was this tremendous change that she noticed very starkly. She said it was like being one of those cavemen who, had been unfrozen, and she had woken up in a new world. So we knew that they were fascinating stories that teachers had to tell. How we found them, we assembled a group of researchers, some of whom were journalists and some of whom were education researchers, and we created an interview protocol, and we started with our networks, snowball sampling. And we had people in Chicago, we had people in California, we had somebody in South Florida, we had people in Massachusetts. So we really just asked around, and that led to maybe an initial round of 20 or so interviews. And Justin has his podcast, Teach Lab, and we put a few episodes out on Teach Lab with some initial findings, where I would play a little bit of an interview for Justin and he would reflect on it. And to that, we added a kind of Google form tool for anybody who wanted to volunteer to be interviewed. And so we tried to kind of branch out from snowball sampling. And then about midway through that process, so this would have been spring 2024, probably that fall, we took a look at the demographics of the initial interviews we had done. I would say we'd probably done 30 or 40 at that point, and we thought, who's missing from this? What kind of subject and disciplines do we not have? How's our gender balance? How is our racial balance? How are we doing for rural schools versus urban schools? How are we doing for geographic balance? And we identified some gaps and some holes. And so then we made a targeted effort to fill in those gaps and find teachers and students who could talk with us. Students are awfully hard to recruit. You basically have to know them. Maybe if you do an interview with a teacher, you might say who's a student we could talk to, but it's hard to gain access to them as an adult. You have to make sure that you're approaching in a way that feels safe to children and to the parents. So often you have to know them or know somebody in common. So we also worked with this organization called In Tandem that specializes in making students available for researchers. And they found us some students I don't think we would have been able to access. And some of my favorite stories about AI in schools came from the students we found through In Tandem.
So I have a quick question for both of you, and then I have a longer question, and we'll open it up to my co-hosts. There's always a backstory around forming partnerships like the two of you have, successful ones. Young is our backstory. He got the four of us to work together, now five of us working together with Lydia Cow, contacting us right during COVID, saying, COVID will be gone in a couple of months. Why don't we do a podcast show for a couple of months, Is there any interesting backstory between your collaboration? I ask this from the standpoint of podcasts are becoming really popular today. And there might be other people out there who are listening to this show, who are watching our show, who might say, I'd like to do a podcast, but I don't know how to contact someone to work with me, a producer like Jesse. How does that happen? How does the match happen? And what led to the success that you've had so far?
Well, in 1996, Jesse and I played Ultimate Frisbee together at the University of Virginia, and he and two friends rented a house with a bunch of rooms in it. And Jesse and his friend did not want to invite me to live with them in the apartment, but the third person, Nate, was like, no, I think Justin's okay. I think we should take him.
Justin was a bit rough around the edges in those days. We weren't sure about him.
And so, but then I don't know, I've done a bunch of media production over the last 10 years of online courses and documentaries and other kinds of things. And Jesse's been, a sort of valued expert throughout that process, periodically, sometimes helping more directly with things. But a lot of times we would say like, okay, how do we do this? How do we Jesse has a great eye Jesse worked for a long time with researchers of all kinds in history and other fields to make their work more accessible to public audiences. And so I've counted on his expertise for that for a long time. So the best way to get into podcasting is to go to college and make friends.
I'll add a little I'll add a little bit to that. I mean, I remember it was probably 2017 or 2018. Justin had hired a team to launch the Teach Lab podcast, and I think I got an email or a text that was like, "I made a podcast," and it was the first episode. I don't think it had been released yet, and it was very good. But there are also things I could hear as somebody who was, 15 years into a radio and podcast production career that I thought they could be doing better. And so, I think I wrote Justin back and said something like, "This is a very good start. You have some real strengths as a podcast host. You have a great topic, and there's some little things you could be doing to make this a lot better. And would you like to have a conversation about that?" And Justin, to his credit, said yes. And I kind of met with his production team and helped them format that. And, I've actually been thinking, Kurt, about designing a series of classes, one class called Podcasting for Academics and another class called Academics for Podcasting, because I know a lot of colleagues, and there's been a bit of a dip in the podcasting industry. So there are some people who are between jobs and out of work. And I think there's a tremendous potential for researchers out there who want to disseminate their research to a wider audience to use podcasting to do that. And I think that could be a very, very favorable kind of collaboration. And I think there's a tremendous value in those researchers hiring a podcast or radio producer in doing that well. And so that's I'm sort of almost proselytizing along those lines. And even if that's just a one-time 2-hour consultation. Here's the podcast we made. Listen to it and tell us what you think we could be doing better. That's super productive. But if you have a little bit of a budget and you want to make a podcast to share your research in addition to whatever forums that you are, that you're disseminating it, having somebody who's actually in the business, I think can help a lot.
So I asked that first because I know we're going to move into your research that you're collecting and reporting on and so forth. So I wanted to get that one out of the way first. But now, people might be interested in how I got to contact Justin for this show. I have read your article in the Chronicle of Higher Education. Of course, I've contacted Justin many times to be on this show. And this first time he said, yes. No, he had said maybe many times. He wrote an article in the Chronicle of Higher Education, "Stop pretending you know how to teach AI. Colleges are racing to make students fluent. There's one problem. No one knows what fluency means, or AI fluency." So, and that's true. I sampled people at the AECT conference, and pretty much every university is creating a certificate or emphasis in AI literacy or AI research, whatever, just generative AI. They're all, and they put a course on ethics, they put a course on policy and a couple others, but really no one could define what AI literacy is. So you've got a guidebook and you've done podcast shows. So for the potential listening audience out there that might watch this show in a month, or this, I get a lot of people watch the next day or they listen the next day. Think of an audience, possible audience for your guidebook, for your podcast that you've been producing, for your research and interviews. What do you want to say to them? To pick any audience you want. What you've produced, what can you say to them? What could they get out of your guidebook? What will they get out of your podcast shows? What will they get out of your writings? Justin, you want to start?
Jesse? I'll start, sure. When Jesse came to me and said the team wants to make a guidebook, my first response was no, we're not making a guidebook. There are 8,000 guidebooks. We're not going to publish the 8,001st guidebook. That's not helpful. And Jesse went back and talked to his colleagues, and he said, no, actually, I've talked to a bunch of teachers, and they think that there's something missing and that we could be helpful. And I was like, okay, fine. If they say they want us to do it, we'll do it. But there's 2 rules. Rule number 1 is that everything in it needs to come from practicing educators. People who are really far away from classrooms. I think that I could go into this more, but I think there's a long history of people making bad guesses about how to respond to new technologies. I think advice is as likely to be wrong as right in early stages of new technology hype cycles. And so at least if we picked advice from practicing educators, then we could be confident that it had some grounding in real classrooms and real tests. And the second thing I said is that we had to be really clear that we did not know if what we were sharing was good advice. We were going to frame what we were offering as a series of hypotheses. And that, I think, is really the main sort of ask and offering that I have for educators these days, is that We don't know how to respond to the arrival of generative AI in schools. Historically, we have not always, like as a field of education, education researchers, teachers, made good guesses about how to respond to new technologies. And so the best way to move forward is with a kind of local science approach, is to say, okay, we don't really know exactly what the right step is, but we have to do something. We could say more about why we think the evidence from the podcast suggests that you have to do something. So you have to do something. Well, go out with humility, acknowledging to all your stakeholders and your colleagues that we don't know exactly what to do, and start trying and testing some things. And we can help you try and test more things that sound sensible for your context by telling you lots of stories about what other people are trying and what they feel like is working and what they're not working. I'm hoping in 10 years that won't be my advice to schools. I'm hoping that in 10 years my advice to schools will be like, you know what, like educational researchers have done some pretty good work around this. We actually have some pretty good ideas. Like we know what a pretty good AI policy looks like, or we know what good instructional practice in seventh grade math with AI looks like. So there's expertise now. But I think I think we are an unfortunately large number of years away from having that codified expertise. But you have to do something. And so the guidebook and the podcast is really about getting people to share from the classroom perspective where they're at and what they're trying and what might work. I don't know. What would you add, Jesse?
In the fall of 2024, we partnered with RAND, which does I forget what they call it, but a massive survey of teachers every year, national education,
A national teacher panel,
national
nationally
teacher panel.
representative sample of teachers.
And we asked a series of questions that basically were getting at what kind of guidance and professional development teachers were getting from their school or from their district. And I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but it was something like about 1/4 of teachers said they had gotten any guidance about the arrival of AI. And this is roughly 2 years after ChatGPT had appeared on the scene. And roughly 1/4 said they had gotten any professional development. And I sat in on some professional development sessions in the course of this research and reporting, a few different places. There was probably the gold standard was a school in the suburbs of New York City that offered their teachers 2 days of professional development paid during the summer, all about AI. And what I found was that the teachers who had had some kind of structured opportunity to talk with their colleagues and talk with their administrators, talk with their librarians, talk with their tech people in their schools who had just had a chance to sort of talk through the challenges raised by AI around academic integrity, around privacy issues, also the opportunities raised by AI, just seemed more comfortable doing their job. And, so they were talking about ways in which they could integrate AI into their teaching and experiments they were doing. I don't know, trying to get students in an English class to chat with an AI bot about the book that they're reading and then turning that chat in. Or maybe getting ideas about curriculum from an AI bot. And, Justin's point is we don't really know if these teaching moves, if this sort of thing is actually effective or not. But just having these conversations, talking about those ideas, talking about what their experience was with these things, talking about their strategies to keep students from bypassing learning and using AI to do work that they want the students to do with their own brain. At the very least, that was comforting to the teachers. They felt more equipped to handle the challenge of this moment. And that was a very, very clear finding. And that was one of the motivations behind the quote unquote guidebook, which doesn't really offer any prescriptive guidance. It's more of an orientation. It's almost like an AI atlas and gazetteer or something like that.
So Chris, you're going to jump in with a comment or a question.
Well, AI literacy is an interesting construct. And I have the feeling that if you brought 20 people working in education into a room, there'd be 23 different frameworks for AI literacy that they would have developed. There's a glut of these frameworks. And what's astonishing to me is how few of them actually build on prior frameworks for literacy, because it's not like we haven't done frameworks for literacy before. And so in my talks, I say there's technical fluency. So with print, it's reading and writing. And in schools, we say, well, if you can read and write, then you're literate. But there's also socio-technical literacy based on reading and writing. So you need to understand books and libraries and industrial era schooling built around reading and writing and other, kinds of developments that are part of the infrastructure of print that are part of literacy. And so I'm dismayed when all these AI literacy frameworks say, well, it's prompt engineering and knowing what apps to use, and that's it. Well, yeah, that's reading and writing. But how are we reinventing the book? How are we reinventing the library? How are we reinventing the university and so on, based on what Gen AI brings to the table? So the socio-technical literacy at this point is emerging, even as the technical literacy is emerging, but the socio-technical literacy is really emerging. And I say this in part because if you look at say the medieval monks who lived at the time of the printing press, some of them must have said, wow, I can do something better than illuminated manuscripts now. And I'm going to shape this new socio-technical opportunity. I'm not just going to consume it, I'm going to shape it. And so I think your emphasis on teachers and students as not just consumers, but as actually as shapers, especially of the socio-technical dimensions, is an interesting one. Now, there is a question that I have, having made a little sermon here. There's a tremendous amount of misinformation about AI, and more than usual, it's coming from the providers. So providers have always oversold the ed tech that they want to sell, but the degree of overselling and misinformation that approaches, in my opinion, lying, is really extraordinary. So as you put a stake in the ground, what sort of assumptions are you making about, for example, how close we are to artificial general intelligence, as opposed to saying this is a really great way of doing natural language processing. We can harvest a lot from that, but it's not really beyond that. When you look behind the curtain, there's just a little man, pushing knobs and dials. I'm curious from each of you as to what your stance is, not because there's anybody that knows the answer, but because we all do make educated guesses based on our background.
I think Justin should go first. Although, I don't know, Justin, if you want, I have an anecdote. I feel like I would only add questions to this question.
Go ahead, Jesse. Add questions to this question.
Okay. Well, we are actually working on a two-part podcast series as kind of a follow-up about AI literacy. And in the course of preparing for that, I was going through all the roughly 120 interviews our team did and thinking about the conversations and some off-record conversations I had with, we had a panel of advisors when we put together the AI guidebook, and how often the term AI literacy came up. And I realized that term, not even frameworks that you're talking about, Chris, but that term was being used in at least three different ways, and that they were overlapping, and that when people were using that term, they weren't necessarily distinguishing. So one is the idea that teachers ought to learn something about AI, and I think what you would call the technical aspects of AI. What is a large language model? Why is it sometimes reliable and sometimes not? What is the jagged frontier? That teachers need to learn something about AI and its affordances in order to adapt effectively to this arrival technology. One is the idea that teachers ought to be communicating something to their students about the appropriate and responsible use of AI and why it might be suitable in some instances and not suitable in other instances. And another is the idea that we should be teaching students how to effectively use AI, essentially prompt engineering, because they are going to need that skill, we hypothesize, in the future, because AI is going to have that impact on because that is going to have that impact on the workplace. And, and I think that my sense of Justin's point of view is that the first two definitions are a little bit more defensible in terms of bringing into school than the latter is more purely speculative. But there was this instance that this story that came up, and we're going to talk about it in this upcoming podcast episode, where a teacher named Tony, I think he's an 8th grade social studies teacher, had required his students to write a short research paper, maybe 1,000 words, and cite a certain number of sources in the context of that research, and using proper citation and that sort of thing. And, these were pretty rudimentary sources, and this student was writing about the history of corn or maize, the plant. And the student wrote that corn had been present in ancient Mesopotamia, which is not true. Corn comes from Guatemala or Central America somewhere. And the student's source for this was Google search responding in AI mode. And I don't know if you're familiar nowadays, and just within the last year or so, when you type a search query into Google, it gives you an AI-powered response that is a AI-powered large language model summary of various search terms. And those responses are sometimes accurate, sometimes not. Like any large language model output, it has the affordances and the weaknesses of that. And the student, his teacher said, no, this isn't true. What you said about corn being present in ancient Mesopotamia just isn't true. And the student pointed at the Google search and said, look, it says it right here. It says right here. And the teacher had to explain that the Google's AI mode search results are not a reliable source, and had to describe to the best of his ability and in a way that an 8th grade student could understand what is happening in Google AI search mode, which, most of us don't really know, but we know it's probably some sort of version of a large language model like Gemini or ChatGPT. It's predicting one word at a time. It's probabilistic. It's something like that. It can easily hallucinate. So he's explaining to this student who's just, bewildered that something the student found on the internet, on Google, is inaccurate. And one of the questions I had for Justin in this moment is, does this constitute AI literacy instruction? And I think that's a really intriguing question, and I don't think we entirely know what the answer is. And also, if it does constitute AI literacy, what skill set is this teacher drawing on in order to help that student understand what needs to be understood in that particular moment? So that's one question. I think another question that I'm wrestling with right now, and again, Chris, I think I'm complicating your question with more questions, but if you think about those monks after the invention of the printing press, the monks who are thinking, oh, wow, there might be an opportunity to use this new technology so that I'm no longer simply somebody who has to copy one manuscript to another. Now we can automate that, and we can actually use this as a creative tool. Between the time of that and the time at which, say, we really perfected the modern novel is something like 200 years. 200 years, so here's this new technology that automates writing and transcription. And then 200 years later, we start getting novels like, Mark Twain and Charles Dickens and Bram Stoker writing these wonderful novels in the late, or we have, writers like Chekhov, writing in the late 19th century. By the time we start adapting to whatever the newest version of AI is, we have a new version of it every 3 or 4 years. And so one of the things I've been wondering about is, does the current pace of technological innovation give us a chance to develop those literacies before the technology changes again and we have to develop a new literacy? So anyway, that was super big, and maybe Justin can help ground my reflections into something more useful.
No, that's great, Jesse. And, another question Chris asked is sort of Like what's our bet on the future of generative AI as a technology? I think I don't have one. I think I don't have any idea. I think I have two strategies along these lines. One is to just encourage people to be open to lots of possibilities and to recognize um, that the most optimistic voices might be right, and they also might be wrong. There was a moment a couple of years ago. I was on a podcast a couple of years ago with a guy who was like, isn't this just going to exponentially grow, just get better and better and better? And I was like, well, some like for those fond of math, like when you're in the middle of it, an exponential growth curve and a logistic growth curve look pretty similar. You can have things shooting up, and they can keep shooting up, or they can flatten out. Um, but then a bet that I do make is that ed tech hype cycles are like basically the same, that schools are pretty stable, that the introduction of technology into school systems is pretty stable, that like the things that we've learned from Larry Cuban and other folks over the last 100 years, like they work pretty good. When teachers get access to new technologies, they use them to extend existing practices. New technologies disproportionately benefit the affluent, people with the financial, social, and technical capital to take advantage of new innovations. If you want something good to happen with a technology, it's not going to be from the technology. The technologies are only as powerful as communities that guide their use. The process of having communities become better at integrating technologies takes place over years, not weeks or things like that. And though I think those lessons are going to prove pretty durable, I'm always open to evidence that there's something sort of profoundly different about any new technology. That whether it's iPads or MOOCs or generative AI or whatever, like one of them for sure could be different. But my experience is that if you have a sense of how these things tend to unfold, then that's pretty good guidance for predicting the future.
And the claim is always this one is different. Yeah, we know that those other technologies did not lead to the sort of transformations that we hoped for, but this time it will. We're pretty sure. There's something inherent about this technology that does feel different. And AI does feel that way, right? I mean, it's understandable why people feel that way about it. It does something we've never seen before. But probably some of those other technologies felt that way too. And we've just gotten used to them.
I'm fascinated by like the retconning of old technology. I call this the web is meh argument. Like sometimes people make claims along the lines of like, well, yeah, AI is totally different. Like what the web, the web just never could do what AI could do. And I was like, my guy, we put a handheld supercomputer in the pocket of every person in the networked world over the age of 13, and that computer has like a pretty substantial portion of the world's corpus of information, connects them to billions of people, including all of the people they know at any given time. And honestly, it wasn't that helpful for learning, and it really probably wasn't helpful at all for schooling. Like that, it was a big deal. What we technologically, socio-technologically accomplished was a big deal. And to go, I don't know.
Well, I have to jump in here for a second because I recently saw a study which said that people who are studying learning using ChatGPT remember less than if they did a Google search. So I immediately went and did a lit survey and I found articles from 10 years ago which said that people who are using Google search were learning less than those who read it from books. And so the previous, and I just thought it was hilarious. And I have a draft of a blog post sitting, which hopefully one of these days I'll hit publish on. But I just find that so whether it's for the positive or the negative, the latest technology is either the best thing or the worst thing, depending on where you stand on it, which I just thought was funny. Anyway,
I
sorry
wonder,
to
I
interrupt.
So I have to
wonder,
jump
It
in
depends
before
on
Young
how.
here a second. Justin, I introduced you, Justin Wright, Jesse Dukes, but I introduced my co-hosts. We have with us Christine from Harvard. We have with us Punya Mishra from Arizona State University, and Young Zhao, who's coming to us from University of Kansas. Lydia Cao is in China this week. And I'm Kurt Bong from Indiana University, the number one football team in America. Anyways, Young, you want to jump in here?
Now, when Punya said depends, I think it depends on your age too, so, because we've seen all of this. If you look at a 13-year-old or a 5-year-old who is playing with ChatGPT, they would not know anything about anything, right? It's so the but Chris, you started a great conversation because I just want to go back to to Jess and Justin. Rain, this is not even, this is a comment. They have a serious question later. Was about this, where does corn start? Because, I grew up in China and I recently traveled to many different countries. There's deliberate hallucination. They don't even, I think governments, religious groups have done this for centuries. They always manufacture stories to convince you, right? I mean, they don't really care. I think for China, like, well, China invented everything, and so did Greece. So that's another. So it's actually very fascinating when we think about what's truth. Of course, where did corn come from? Didn't really matter to me, but it matters. Historically, I'm sure it matters to some people. But that's a really interesting way to think about hallucination. I remember, I think a few episodes ago, we had two people, Punya, you invited from somewhere on the West Coast, talking about again hallucination. We are very serious about hallucination, but we can only deal with technological hallucination without thinking about deliberate manipulation. And they actually control that. And that's called, we call that brainwashing. So this is another reason a lot of times when people talk about education, as if education is the same in every country, in every culture. Well, I remember, I think Kansas and Texas were still talking about intelligent design. So there's that's anyway. That's not my real question, but that was just my rambling about all the whole thing. It's a great conversation. We could have a long conversation about this for a long time. It's kind of fun. But my serious question is this: since you guys have done 120 episodes in schools, I bet it's all in American schools, right? I mean, in the U.S. schools, and I hope it's in blue and the red states, and I hope it's kind of diverse enough. I love what Justin, you wrote about the Larry Cuban kind of ideas. Technology alone is not going to change education, and I'm already seeing that schools, traditional schooling or the grammar of schooling, already kind of is desensitizing the power of AI. It's not in. But no matter what, when we talk about AI literacy, when we talk about impact of AI, we're hoping that the entrance of AI to schools should bring some changes. And so I was just wondering, out of all your interviews and your research around this topic, how much do you see like the traditional model, teachers use AI to plan lessons, do homework, use it to grade homework, students use it to do homework. I mean, that's the one traditional model. And teachers feel, they're relaxed, they do less work, which is not bad. I mean, honestly, nobody's doing real work, which that's what technology is about, right? It's we invent it so we can be lazier. So the Puna, in a sense, why not? And then towards more transformational, like schools actually doing different kind of work. They're not teaching language the same way. They're not teaching math the same way. Toward more really transforming the curriculum because I'm big on personalization. That is, you follow your passion, your interest to create new learning. So, how much do you see real changes, or are we simply going to say, Larry Cuban is right? So that's basically so. What do you guys think about that?
He's right so far. I think. I mean, what I saw talking to a lot of teachers and students is to the degree to which AI is transforming instruction and the instructional model, a lot of experiments at the margins, a lot of small experiments. And I don't know, Justin, tell me if that's ringing untrue to you, but what I mostly heard was,
I'm trying to, do we meet any revolutionaries? I mean, we met some people who were like, this is going to be a big deal, but they did. I don't know that any of the people we talked to were like, we got to tear it all down. We got to start over. Um,
It's
not
mostly
who
it's
I
a
think we
neutralization, right? I mean, it's the neutralizing, basically what AI can be.
I mean, hard to know because I think it's still so new, and because teachers are in schools are so locked into the models that they're locked into. I mean, I think I talked to, and if I probably twice as many teachers who are encountering AI as a challenge that they have to figure out basically around academic integrity. How do I keep my students from bypassing learning? How do I redesign my assignments? How do I pay more attention to my students? How do I engage them in conversation that I can be sure that they're really learning? To me, just within the first 2 to 3 years of the arrival, that seemed to be the main impact. And then maybe a third of the teachers we've talked to, and I think there's some survey data who backs this up, are excited to experiment, and they're trying this, they're trying that. We talked to one teacher who is teaching, he has a film program he does in Southern California that's a combination of film and English, and he's open to his students using AI in that class, maybe to get feedback on their script writing or maybe get suggestions, and he's experimenting with that sort of thing. We talked to another teacher who teaches a robotics and electronics and computer programming class, and he's having his students sort of vibe code Arduino Unos into doing interesting things and experiment with things like that. But I certainly have heard those revolutionaries on the outside and in the industry and in the nonprofits and among the researchers, but I can't think of a teacher who has really transformed what they're doing with AI offhand from our set. I mean, Justin, am I missing something?
No, I don't think so. I mean, and then you have to wonder, like, maybe we interviewed wrong, maybe these people are out there somewhere, maybe the kinds of people who come and talk to us, the revolutionaries are going to find other revolutionary podcast hosts to talk to. Though, you sort of, I mean, I have not heard a story of a school, kind of.
Well,
really...
there's the famous AI school. I forget. We were talking about them. I'm not remembering the name right now.
The one in Texas?
Alpha School.
Alpha School. Yeah.
Although they're really not transforming their school using AI. They're trying, I don't know, a sort of different school model, and they talk about AI a lot. But there are lots
I mean,
of
there's a long, nice, lovely story in Wired, I think, a couple of month or so ago by Bahuni Vara, which just takes apart that model about and what's really going on there, which is like really, really interesting. So yeah.
Its problem was like the old Google school. You remember that in San Francisco, they were trying that. It's the small school. But anyway, I mean, the alpha, I'm not commenting on that. So sorry about that,
Yeah. Well, and I mean, I do think you could find teachers who say, I like this new technology. I'm excited to experiment with it. I've done some experiments. Some of them have worked well. Some of them have not. I'm going to keep doing this. I'm going to stop doing that. And I think it's saving me some time. I would say those are a majority. I'm sorry. I would say those are a minority of teachers right now, but it's early, and we might get, in 10 years or so, we might get to the point where we know enough about the technology and the cycle has slowed down enough that that's the majority of teachers. And, and that would be great. And I think that's something Justin documents in his book. But what I have seen is, what is this? Oh no, my students are using it to do their homework. How do I keep them from doing that? And then some chunk of them who are, hey, this is really cool. What's something I can try with my students to get them to engage with this? Or what's something I can try to save myself a little time? And it might be as simple as, I'm going to get it to write the first draft of a recommendation letter, or I'm going to divide the groups into the field trip buses randomly so they all sit with at least one friend and one person they don't know, or that sort of thing. Little administrative tasks that they're getting AI to help them with, which, in the last 2 or 3 years, I've been experimenting with as a journalist, and with some success too. There's certainly potential. I do think one place where we've heard a lot of optimism is around accessibility. A lot of teachers are telling us that differentiation of texts and quick translation has been really useful. We heard a pretty fascinating differentiation story from a Spanish teacher who had her students reading Spanish texts that were too advanced for them, and she asked them to use AI not to translate those texts, but to differentiate the texts into a easier Spanish so that they would still have to translate from Spanish to English. I thought that was very, very clever. There have been some teachers, who are ESL or English language learner teachers who might have more levels of English level learning in their class than they really should. They might have level 1, 2, 3, and 4, which is probably challenging. So they might be taking a text that they found for their level 4 English language learners and differentiating that into level 3, 2, and 1 so that all of their students can read the same text. And definitely a lot of optimism around accessibility as well, although, still early and still not a lot of stories about that.
So Punya.
Sure. So I'm going to change the topic a little bit. Back in November, early in November, we had two guests from India on the show who work with youth across the country. And one of them wrote this fantastic article in Caravan. And this is about a place I'm from a place in India originally called Odisha, which is a pretty impoverished, poor sort of part of the country. Though, if you can go to schools there, they have all the latest tech, smart phone boards and all of that kind of stuff now because of some initiatives by the government. But what she was looking at is this young students, particularly she had this case study of this one young woman who was getting radicalized by YouTube to the extent that she would go and start questioning the history textbooks that they were being given in school, right? And that, oh, I know what the real history is because this YouTube channel has told me, it's the right-wing Hinduatva sort of revisionist history of India. And so the broader question, I think that they actually came up with a report, which is actually kind of a really cool report. I have it right here with me, sort of looking across 6 or 7 different states. These are kids who usually don't get discussed when we talk about whether it's AI or social media and so on. And it's this long tentacles of Silicon Valley going and tapping a 13-year-old girl in Khurda in Odisha, and the algorithms sort of playing, and so on and so forth. And so this is sort of a long-winded way of getting at the point that even like, I remember I've written blog posts back in 2007, 2008, when the Arab Spring was happening and then social media and the web and being like, wow, this is the democratization of knowledge. This is, the next Gutenberg revolution and so on and so forth. And now in hindsight, sort of kicking myself on the side of my head that I didn't think about the broader economic structures that guided the evolution of this technology of social media in particular around engagement onto platforms, around extreme content, around information bubbles, and so on and so forth. So the question I have started asking more now is that maybe by this focus of looking at school, I mean, again, I'm not saying let's not do that. That's what my career, that's all of our careers have been. However, maybe we need to ask ourselves bigger, deeper questions, sort of like McLuhan would ask or Postman would ask about how broader culture is changing because of this technology. And that whether or not, let's say if you're a teacher back in 2008 and they said, I don't want Facebook, I don't want Instagram, I don't want to deal with this, you never created an account. It doesn't matter because your kids now in your classroom are living in a world which has been transformed because of this, whether in the political sense, in the economic sense, in whatever sense you want to think about. We live in a very different ecosystem, an information ecology ecosystem today. And so I'm wondering whether any of these kinds of topics or issues came up in the conversations that you had. Because to me, it's not what we're doing in the classrooms, but it's rather what's happening in the world around that is transforming the classroom. I mean, it's sort of the same way of thinking about, that there's this quote by, I don't know, Edison or somebody that film is going to transform education. Well, guess what? Film didn't transform the classroom, but film transformed the world within which the classroom exists. Whether it's the rise of fascism, whether it's the rise of independence movements across the world against colonialism, good and bad, both of those things happening because of radio and film and so on. And so I'm wondering whether as people working in this field, we are sort of not asking the right questions. And maybe the questions are bigger, that we need to expand our vision in some way. And the final comment I will make on this is that when a student is getting radicalized, let's say by a YouTube channel, it can be seen in their browser history. It can be, we can find that channel ourselves and we can petition YouTube to take it down or whatever. Whether or not they do is a different question. When you have this one-on-one conversation with the chatbots and we're seeing what Grok is doing, and we will never even know what's going on in these conversations outside of what's happening in the classrooms. So again, there's a whole bunch of issues, and I've been really sort of struggling, I don't know, maybe too strong a word, but trying to wrap my head around and say, okay, what does this AI mean as a cultural technology as opposed to an epistemic or an educational technology? And that maybe that's what we should be focused on. So any insights or thoughts that come from that, or just as a conversation or opener, really? I mean, I think anybody can jump into that. There is really nothing specific to. Oh, by the way, I'm a huge fan of your podcast, but it's one of my walk
Thank
the
you.
dog, homework machine is rolls by. So anyway,
Thanks, Anya.
just would love to hear your thoughts.
Oh, how about this about this moment? I think practicing educators want to talk about these kinds of things. I would say that every generation of technology generates different kinds of anxieties and concerns. To me, that's sort of standard fare to be expected. What if the kids know more about this than I do? How am I going to adapt? Is it going to make more work for me or less work for me? Do I have time? All kinds of things. I would say large language models, teachers reported to us what to me are well, I can say this. They regularly report not just sort of local professional concerns, but really like existential concerns. What is this going to do to our whole profession? What is this going to do to the environment? What is this going to do to our society? What is this going to do to our democracy? Our interview protocol starts with the question, how's your year going? Overall, it's a very open-ended, like we're mostly really trying to source out like what's top of mind for teachers. What do they want to talk about? And they wanted to talk to us, not all of them, but many of them wanted to talk to us about their existential concerns. And I don't know that we have good sort of comparative data from wave to wave, but having worked on this for a long time, like all of you guys have, I've never heard this degree of existential concern did not come up when we put iPads in the classroom, did not come up when the web showed up, did not come. I mean, there are portions of it, maybe connections to it, but I would say I would say teachers are very concerned about the kinds of issues you're talking about, both for what happens to their whole society. I think that, particularly anchored maybe in the profession, like what does it mean to be a teacher with these kinds of tools around? Yeah, we heard a lot of this.
I've been in Asia 5 times in the last 6, 7 months, and when I was in Korea, that came up a lot, in particular with English professors. They're really worried about losing not only their jobs, but their whole department, their whole meaning, their whole field, you know. And I
It,
didn't have a really good answer for them at the time, but I've been thinking about it. Anyways, Jesse, you're going to jump in there?
Well, Punya mentioned Neil Postman, who wrote this book in the early 80s, whose hypothesis was, at the time, what now seems like a rather naive version of a new media, which was essentially television, and the soundbite and the way that our political debates were being mediated through sound bites and maybe later sort of like scandals and pseudo events. Neil Gabler wrote about this too, was ruining our ability to have civic discourse in a thoughtful way. It was ruining our ability to think. And I think that to your point, Kurt, it's the English teachers who are the most alarmed about this, because the English teachers don't just see writing and literature as kind of a set of facts and a way of evaluating their students' skills or ability or technical knowledge. They see a one-to-one between reading, writing, and thinking. And so they're absolutely on existential alert. And I think, there's other kinds of teachers, maybe science teachers, maybe math teachers, who see AI as something more like a calculator, which is like, yeah, it automates some boring parts of the thought process, and that could actually be useful. I don't quite know what to make of that, because I don't know, Neil Postman seems to me to have predicted the rise of ultranationalism in the last 10 years. But if you read Neil Postman in 1988, he might just seem like a kind of Luddite crank. And it's a little bit hard to know when somebody is just being reflexively pessimistic about something new because new things are uncomfortable, or because they are really right. But it does seem to be I don't know. There does seem to be a value in at least hearing the English teachers out when it comes to their concerns around the relationship between writing and thinking and what happens when you automate writing and whether that eliminates thinking. And the English teachers who are saying, you know what, my response to AI is that we're handwriting everything, that doesn't sound like a terribly bad idea to me right now. I mean, there are others who say, no, my students need to start engaging with AI and using it as a tool. And I certainly see the argument for that as well. But that reflexive sort of backward looking, let's ground this in what we know works, seems to make a lot of sense. The other thing that question raises for me is something Justin and I have been talking about, and I'm kind of like trying to develop a 4x4 in my head, but it's this notion of trust. And what do we trust? And we have had teachers talk existentially about how they are starting to lose their trust of their students because they don't know whether the work they're getting from their students is their students' thoughts or not, and how exhausting that is. But I also think the thing that we're all doing right now, I'm a journalist, and this is something I'm grappling with, is going through a process of what externally we trust anymore. When we talk about citation and we talk about what a valid source is and we talk about what a fact is, those are all contested. But for the most part, during periods where we're not having this kind of technological upheaval, we arrive at we arrive at periods of agreement, and we decide this is what a fact is, this is what a reliable source is. AI is really challenging that right now. Google search mode is really challenging that. Deepfakes are really challenging that. And sometimes you get results from AI search mode that are completely reliable and useful, and other times you don't. And how do we know which are which? And how do we, and what are the ethics of the AI scraping all the various databases they scraped and the various writing they scraped in order to train themselves? So I do think we're in this period of sort of a crisis of trust, and I don't know how we'll emerge from that, but that is definitely something that teachers are anxious about.
This is something I've been really, because there are these broader issues of parasocial relationships and so on. I mean, there's just a lot here, and one of the things that I'll just one quick comment and then I'll stop. But the one way of thinking about sort of the broader political and the technological, if you think about Roosevelt as being sort of the first radio president, Kennedy, maybe Reagan mastered it as a television president. And, Obama, you could say, is the sort of internet first version president. And now we have somebody who's an absolute master at this social media. Wherever your politics lie, you cannot deny the ability to capture attention, which is sort of the critical piece in this day and age. And so that's what I wonder about, is that maybe we should be casting, again, I'll repeat myself here, but a wider net as we think about what this means for education and citizenship and democracy and trust and truth and all of those things, that there is a bigger conversation to be had, which sometimes we miss when we focus too narrowly on the classroom.
So we might have to bring you guys back, is what Punya's saying. We're going to have to introduce the next show in a minute or so, but real quickly, Justin and Jesse, a couple quick things. Are there, for professors like me who teach graduate level courses, are there cases in your guidebook that we could use in our graduate courses to teach about this? How have you structured the book?
I think one of the most useful things my hunch is most people are familiar with a lot of sort of frameworks that are circulating, a lot of ideas of like, what are some pros and cons? What is an ethical framework for AI? What is, what are instructional strategies? The main contribution of the guidebook is that we have teachers who articulate all of those things. So like in our chapter on AI ethics, there's a list of sort of commonly framed categories of ethical dilemmas, and then we have quotations about how practicing educators are thinking about them. Instructional strategies, pros and cons, concerns, those kinds of things. So I think if you're reading stuff and you're finding that it's at a kind of abstract level, then maybe the guidebook can help ground some of those ideas in the words of practicing teachers and school leaders.
One other quick thing. Did your research get funded? Was it funded? People are going to listen to the show and going to say, well, 120, how did they get the money for that? Don't want a long answer.
Thanks, Jesse. Can we do that?
Yeah, we got support from the Spencer. I should be able to do this from memory. We got support from the Spencer Foundation. That was the initial grant when we had the idea. We went and talked with the Spencer Foundation. They said, great idea. and they got us started. And then in the midst of, once we got going, there were a number of grants that appeared. There was social and ethical responsibility. I can't
From
remember the acronym.
computing. So
In computing,
social
it's
and
an
ethical
internal
responsibilities of computing at
MIT
MIT.
grant.
The
Wonderful
Jameel World
organization.
Education Lab inside
Yep.
MIT.
And then GARA, Google's Academic Research Award. So Google actually provided some of the funding too. And in the credits of the podcast, we thank all of the funders.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think
So
if there's
thank you
anybody.
guys. I appreciate having you on the show today. Go to the Hope Machine and listen to their podcast. Go to the Guide to AI in Schools Perspectives for Perplexed. You'll get much insight into the use of AI in education today. So thanks, Justin. Thanks, Jesse. Do you have a final comment to make before we switch it to Chris to introduce the next show?
I'll just
No,
echo what Justin just said, which is that when it comes to these existential questions that AI raises, our teachers and our students very much want to be part of those conversations. And it is valuable to listen to them.
Justin?
Just exactly what Jesse said. And thanks, guys, so much for having us.
Thanks for coming on. Chris?
Well, thanks to both of you again for doing this. And what you're accomplishing is not only influencing the present, but it's going to influence the future in the sense that there will be this wonderful repository at a particular point in time of all of these events and people working to accomplish something. So next week, Saturday, January 24th, I have a wonderful colleague at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, Professor Fernando Reimers, who does a lot of work with global ed tech, particularly global South countries. He's been on Silver Lining for Learning before, but we're asking him back because he and his colleagues have written a book called Can AI Transform Education Systems in the Global South? And all of the authors will be on our next podcast to discuss this. So see you then.